Fenerbahçe, Beşiktaş, Galatasaray. If you look at the history of the Turkish Superliga, nearly every title was won by one of those clubs. But now there's a new giant in Turkish football, İstanbul Başakşehir.
Başakşehir are the champions.
Last week, İstanbul Başakşehir beat Kayserispor 1-0 to win the Turkish league, and by doing so, they became just the third club outside of Turkey's Big Three to do so. Today, we look at how İstanbul Başakşehir cracked Turkey's Big Three and what it means for Turkish football.
Başakşehir's title victory hopefully will shock the big three teams in Turkish football into actually addressing the horrible mess that they're currently in.
John McManus is an anthropologist and the author of the book Welcome to Hell, In Search of the Real Turkish Football.
Bad debts, kind of unwarranted sense of entitlement, and just a general all-round malaise. Hopefully the victory of this kind of new kid on the block will shake them out of their complacency and force them to address some of those issues. And of course there's also quite a lot of political symbolism around the victory, which I'll go into more detail about, I'm sure.
In many ways, their title this year stems back to last year. You went to one of their games last year against Galatasaray at the end of the season, and that virtually kind of decided the title race. Can you describe maybe the lead up to that game and what happened that night?
So Başakşehir last season were miles ahead of everyone else for pretty much the whole season. There were many points clear at the top and were kind of purring until right at the end when they started to choke, just as Galatasaray was starting to put together some victories. And it led in quite like beautiful harmony to this end of season decider, like the penultimate weekend where both sides played each other and basically the winner would be champions. Really, the experience of that game for me and it captured quite a lot of the sort of entitlement that these big three teams in Turkey have when it comes to football. It's not limited to Galatasaray. Fenerbahçe and Beşiktaş are equally kind of feel as if they deserve to be champions every week and every year. And if someone comes along who threatens that, they're treated with a lot of kind of contempt, really. And of course, there's also a very political dimension to Başakşehir because the team is seen as linked to the current government. And last season, there were local elections in around the time that the league was kind of finishing. And during that period, Erdogan kind of invoked Başakşehir explicitly, saying, you know, he was involved in the foundation of the team and that like more football clubs should be run like them.
Başakşehir'i ben kurdum. Başakşehir'i ben kurdum.
Rize'de yükseliyor.
Bir taraftan Rize'de kurtardı işi. O da yükseliyor. Şimdi Başakşehir'i kurdum.
So they're being pulled into this political debate about wider questions of what Turkey should look like, you know, who in Turkey should be encouraged, who in Turkey should be followed, and who should be ignored.
So after the game, when they lost and Galatasaray ended up winning the title, you know, did people think that Başakşehir would be back and contend for a title this year?
Well, I didn't, I have to confess. The reasons are that immediately after the end of the season, their manager, Abdullah Avcı, was poached by Beşiktaş, and he'd been there for 4 or 5 years and was seen as kind of the architect of the success that they'd had, really. Well, I mean, they hadn't won anything, but they did very well, and he was seen as part of that. So they kind of lost their manager. In June that year, the Istanbul municipality, which has links to the club, or had links to the club, it changed hands for the first time since 1994, and it went over to the opposition. So there was this idea that this link between the club and the municipality had been broken. And so, yeah, I thought that they'd kind of missed their chance, perhaps, and they would fade away into, sort of mid-table obscurity. But I hadn't accounted for how much worse the big three teams could get from last season. And this season they've been a lot worse. And Başakşehir recruited a good new manager, and kind of the club itself hasn't really changed its approach. And so with those factors, Başakşehir kind of staying the same and the other sides falling away, they managed to get over the line this season.
We documented how last season they kind of collapsed at the end of the season and lost to Galatasaray. Why was it different this time around?
So I think probably the main reason is the new manager that they hired, a guy called Okan Buruk, who has managed a couple of sides from kind of mid-table sides over the past couple of years, but done very well with them. He was with a side called Akhisar, took them to win the Turkish Cup. And then the season before, he kept Rizespor in the division. They were battling relegation. He kept them in the league. So he kind of earned his spurs with some sides. So it's definitely seen as a kind of up-and-coming manager in Turkey. And he's kind of fulfilled that potential by managing to take them over the line this year. The second reason is that their rivals were even quicker to collapse. So Başakşehir maybe performed a little bit better, or at least same as last season, but Beşiktaş, Galatasaray, Fenerbahçe fell away a lot sooner. And in fact, the rivals for Başakşehir this year were Trabzonspor, which are kind of the fourth biggest team in Turkey in terms of fans, and a side called Sivasspor. And actually, it was those two and Başakşehir who were really challenging for the league and for most of the season. The big three were kind of out of the picture from, before Christmas.
How much of this is them buying their success, though? I mean, if you look at their squad, they have a lot of expensive players like Robinho, Dembaba, Martin Skrtel, El Haro Elia, and Gökhan Inler, names that many people in the Premier League and in other leagues will know of.
Good question. And it's one which I can't 100% answer, because surely those players are not doing this for free. They will probably be being paid quite a good wage. But the thing is, actually, a lot of those players, they're not central to the side. The mainstays of this current side are people like the goalkeeper, whose name temporarily escapes me, but is also kind of the Turkish national team goalkeeper. They also have a player called Edin Visca, who is like a Bosnian international who has been at the club for many years and is a fantastic winger. He's kind of really flourished there and has become kind of a mainstay. There's another guy called İrfan Can Kahveci, like a quite talented midfielder. And so even though there are these big names that people have heard of, they've not, for the most part, been mainstays in the side. That actually a lot of the backbone are players that are relatively unknown and are just obviously played quite well. Like I said before, they're not particularly transparent with the finances, so I don't really know comparatively how much they've spent. But certainly Başakşehir, even with these big names, they're certainly not hiring more foreigners than any of the other big three teams. So Galatasaray, Fenerbahçe, Beşiktaş, So even in comparison to them, they're, having a sprinkling of kind of past it foreign players seems to be par for the course in Turkish football.
So do you think that Başakşehir can continue to challenge the big three in upcoming years?
Yes, especially if the big three don't sort out the deep issues with debt and the general structure of their teams. We haven't really gone on to this in much detail, but all of the big three sides are hundreds of millions of euros in debt.
Financially, Turkish football is at a crossroads. Super League clubs have rattled up debts of $2.6 billion, and the Turkish Football Federation had to effectively bail them out by introducing a new loan restructure. Most of the big spending was in Istanbul, with the three biggest clubs announcing that they owe more than $1.8 billion between them to the banks.
At a time when, over the last year or two, the Turkish lira has depreciated by approximately a third against the euro, that makes it, they're in a real hole and it's quite difficult to climb out of it. So obviously there's financial fair play rules and their hiring is very restricted. And of course this season, Başakşehir are going to get another approximately 30-40 billion euros at least from being in the Champions League. So with that injection of cash to Başakşehir, and with the big three still struggling to kind of basically reform themselves to be competitive again, I think that they definitely could stick around for a few more years, especially for the next 2 or 3 years. In some ways, the onus is back on the big three. You know, how do they respond to this challenge? Can they? And one final point, Başakşehir last season had the lowest attendance of any side in the Super League, which I should say is not a division where crowd sizes are particularly great. So even though it's being presented as this new side, perhaps representing a different form of club and maybe representing a different segment of Turkish society, actually there hasn't been much success kind of getting people into the stadiums to back this. So, you know, that in some ways shows the limits of the model. You know, again, I was speaking to someone else who says that there's no creativity behind sort of generation of fans in that way. And maybe the fact that 90% of fans in Turkey already have affiliations with one of the big three clubs means there's not a lot of people to go around for this new side. But in any regards, it's important not to see Başakşehir as, you know, a runaway success. Yes, they've won the championship. Yes, they might do for a few more years. But culturally, are they actually going to become a significant factor in the Turkish football scene? That is a bit more of an open question, and one which probably won't be answered for, you know, a decade or two.
So let's take a look back at their history. When was the club founded and by whom?
Well, officially the club was founded in 2014 by like a consortium of 7 businessmen. But what those 7 businessmen did immediately after founding the club was they bought an existing club, which has a very long title called Istanbul Başakşehir Belediyespor. And that club was founded in 1990. So it's a bit confusing, but Başakşehir on their crest, it says 2014, because that's when the club was initially founded. But they immediately after that kind of absorbed an older club from the 1990s.
Let's go back to that older club from the 1990s for a moment. How successful was that original club? You know, I can't pronounce their full name, but IBB, as I know.
Yeah, IBB is a good way of saying it. Not very. They didn't have a proper fan base. They were a yo-yo club, kind of between the top division and the one below. In Turkey, there's this quite odd phenomenon of municipality-backed sports teams, which, you know, in the UK seems a bit absurd that taxpayers' money would be going on this. But often what happens in Turkey is taxpayers' money are used to fund sport, which have amateur branches and would ordinarily not have funding. In this case, they also had a professional football branch. But yeah, in a city with Galatasaray, Fenerbahçe and Beşiktash, there are no fans going spare, and the side itself, you know, didn't capture hearts and minds. So they were a bit of a non-entity, truth be told.
And so what changed to lead up to the club being bought in 2014, you know, by their current owners now?
I don't think anybody expected that to happen. It was a bit of a shock to a lot of people that this club would be bought. But yeah, it seemed quite soon after their purchase, there were glimpses of the wider plan behind this club. For instance, Başakşehir, the word, it actually refers to a district of Istanbul, quite a far-flung one, very far away from the centre of the city. And in 2013, the municipality kind of signed a contract to build like a 17,500-seater stadium, brand new, in this district, which seems a bit, well, it was like, well, who's going to play in this? Nobody really knew at the time. And then quite soon after this club was bought by the consortium, sure enough, an agreement was signed between the new club to play in this stadium exclusively. So you could also see that someone had kind of a plan to generate a new side in this district and maybe called in, you know, a few favours to sort of help put in place some of the groundwork to make that happen.
Yeah, what was the response to this acquisition? It doesn't seem like it went over well with everyone.
No, there was a lot of anger at the perceived favour that was going into the purchase. I should say that there was no tender process behind the sale of the club. So, especially because it's a public asset, you would ordinarily expect there to be a tender process where, lots of people can bid for it. But it seems it was just sold to this group of businessmen. Price was very reasonable, better than reasonable. So critics felt that, basically it was a sort of quid pro quo between a group of businessmen with links to the ruling party in the municipality, and then the municipality kind of doing their mates a favour.
People are sceptical of Başakşehir's success, and it's down to the club's origins. The club were owned by the municipality, with their current president, Göksel Gümüşdağ, a former vice president of the local government's Congress. This has led to accusations of the club being funded by the state.
And that was shot through also with kind of a bit of mockery because, again, like I'm saying, the big three clubs feel that they rule the roost and, everyone else is kind of treated with a mixture of kind of disdain, mockery.
Let's put on the shoes of that consortium of businessmen. They bought the club for roughly £4.5 million. But as you said earlier, this is a club that didn't really have a fan base. I mean, barely really didn't even have a stadium, except they were building one. What was their motivation for buying this club that at the time, as you said, was a yo-yo club?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, it's obviously not really to make money. I mean, I don't think many people make money from football clubs. Basically, what people think in Turkey is that it's about the symbolism and it's to generate kind of a new football club. And by new, I mean not simply in terms of brand new, as in didn't exist, but also a club which kind of represents something different. So the institutional structure of the club is quite different from that of the vast majority of clubs in Turkey. And obviously, as I mentioned, it has links to the ruling party. And a lot of people in Turkey talk about the material support that comes via like political links, and people get quite upset about this. And they seem to focus just on Başakşehir, as in they are the recipients of government material support. And that actually fails to comprehend that many football teams in Turkey are the recipients of government material support. And it often is sometimes not direct, it's maybe indirect in the form of favourable sponsorship deals, as in prompting a government-backed company to sponsor the team, or allowing the purchase of land to build a new stadium at a very reasonable rate. It's kind of like helping grease the wheels, really. So in some ways, people get angry about that with Başakşehir and kind of ignore that has also gone on with Fenerbahçe, Beşiktaş and Galatasaray in the past. And I think it's the political symbolism of the new side which has really kind of caught people's attention and which is arguably, in my opinion, the more interesting element.
Can you just explain in a little bit more detail those political ties that the club has with politicians and the government?
Yeah, so the president of the consortium is a man called Göksel Gümüşdağ, who is a businessman, but he's also related by marriage to the wife of President Erdogan. There's another member of Başakşehir board who is related by, I think, to one of the Erdogan children by marriage. So there's familial links there. But actually, there's also a broader kind of business links. They come out of the same business nexus, if you will. For instance, the sponsor of the team's official name is actually Medipol Başakşehir. And that name, Medipol, is a health company and it's owned by a guy called Fahrettin Koca, who actually is the health minister of Turkey currently. So you can see that there are business connections, there are also personal connections there between the side and members of the government and the ruling party.
So there's this idea in Turkey that one of the reasons that they're excelling is because they're getting this favorable support from the government and from government funding or government sponsorship almost.
Yes, exactly. And undoubtedly, they are being kind of favorably looked at. As I said before, Erdogan frequently refers to them in kind of his public announcements. And as like a shining standard that we should aspire towards. And they've been on the receiving end of, favourable stadium, and the deal for buying the club was incredibly good. But it is important to realise that this is not unique to Turkish football. Like, previous governments in the past have had similar relations to other sides, including the big sides, and even this government has helped out the big three sides. For instance, Galatasaray and Beşiktaş have built new stadiums in the last 10 years, and the land on which those stadiums are built, or that process, it can't take place without the government kind of giving the green light. Just as a slight tangent, links with the government are kind of essential. Politics and business works in a very different way to in the UK, for instance, that it's quite difficult to be a prominent company or football club and not have links with the government, actually. Like in the UK, it seems it works on very different grounds. But in Turkey, you need to sustain these personal links. You need to kind of doff your cap to whoever's in power. And if that person in power changes, then you doff your cap to the new person. It's just kind of, in some ways, a more patronage-based system of politics. And football clubs are completely part of that and can't escape. So certainly, Başakşehir are the recipients of quite a lot of that patronage right now. But it's important not to see it in binary terms as an off-on, like they either get it or they don't, but to see it more as they are receiving more right now than others are or have in the past.
Are you a fan of football today? Then why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full interviews, and extra content. Just go on Patreon and search Football Today. Now, back to the episode. Right now, they're clearly kind of rocking the ship of the big three Istanbul clubs, Beşiktaş, Fenerbahçe, Galatasaray, three clubs that we've mentioned extensively already. How are they different to those three clubs already, besides the obvious fact that, they don't have that traditional history that those clubs do?
So the structure of the club is very different. It's privately run. So in Turkey, nearly all football clubs are publicly run. There's something called like a dernek, which is like an association, which has members and they elect a president. So not a million miles away from the Spanish kind of socios model that governs, Barcelona and the like. But this Başakşehir are privately run, so they don't have that system. Fans don't become members who vote for people. They can just put in charge whoever they want. And in some ways, this has allowed them to sidestep quite a lot of the factors which are responsible for the big three struggling recently. Having that membership creates a lot of expectation and also more people who kind of want to be involved or want to use the club for certain means. And being devoid of that segment of fandom has, the club in some ways is a bit more lean and can just do what it wants, which has allowed it to kind of, sign the players it wants to sign without worrying about an outcry from the fans and, run budgets how they want to run without an outcry from the fans, etc.
Does that also kind of in turn make them more effective at long-term planning versus kind of short-term planning because they're not as, reactive to their fans?
I think it probably does. I mean, it's hard to know. That they're not the most transparent of clubs, unfortunately. It would be nice if they were a bit more, if they fronted up a bit more about how they're operating. But there's a good contrast with Fenerbahçe, who a couple of years ago appointed a new president, or elected a new president, because it's the fans, called Ali Koç. And he came in and he was like, I'm going to change this club. He appointed Damian Comolli, who is, as director of football, who has worked in the UK in that role for like Liverpool, I think, and a few other clubs. He got a guy from Barcelona to run the youth teams, and it was like, we're going to change the model of this club. But obviously, results in the league didn't immediately change. Like Fenerbahçe was struggling quite significantly, and he felt the pressure from fans. Fans are quite everywhere around the world, kind of. They're not the most patient of people. And so he abandoned the kind of long-term plan. Comolli left about 3 or 4 months ago. And, that Fenerbahçe kind of stuck in this halfway house between trying to implement this longer term plan for a more sustainable, more effective club, and the reality of fans being like, we want a championship now, we want a championship now. And yeah, like Başakşehir are obviously devoid of that fan pressure, and their model is definitely based on many years. And I know for a fact, I spoke to one of their board who was talking about qualifying for Europe, getting increased revenues from Europe, and using that to try and sustain the model. So yeah, they have managed so far, I think, to run quite a tight ship.
Do you see any other clubs trying to emulate some of their methods, or, other people trying to emulate the private ownership model?
It's a very good question. In Turkey, quite a lot of people posit private ownership as kind of a cure-all for a lot of the ills that, Turkish football clubs suffer. But, that in itself is a bit simplistic, because it's only really the structure. You got to still work well within the structure. I was speaking to a Turkish sport journalist yesterday who was telling me, is like, Barcelona aren't privately owned. You don't hear people say Barcelona should be privately owned. Barcelona should be privately owned. That's the root of all their ills. Or I don't know. I'm not a big fan of Spanish football. Maybe you do, but to my knowledge, that's not how they're attacked. And the same in Turkey. I don't think that the big three moving into private ownership would transform their problems overnight, because they still have loads of fans who are with great expectations. And especially in financial fair play era, you can't just inject hundreds of millions of euros into a club with no consequence. So there might be some clubs that go down that route, and maybe even the big three, but it's not really the answer. And I mean, it's more about recruitment policy, which Başakşehir have done quite well, keeping expenditure from getting out of hand, which they've also done quite well. It's kind of the boring things and laying the groundwork, which we'll have to see if the big three can really improve. Well, they need to, really.
If we zoom out further, what does Başakşehir's breaking into the elite of Turkish football mean for not even maybe just football, but even sport in general in the country?
So, I mean, hopefully it will prompt real change in the big three, as I mentioned. But also, I think it's just quite interesting that it gives kind of a coup to the government in terms of the side that they have been partial towards are doing quite well. We haven't really spoken about the symbolism of them winning the league, but basically in Turkey, a sign that, Turkey's a very polarized country. The government tried to posit this side as on their side of the polarized divide, if you will. And to an outside eye, Galatasaray, Fenerbahçe and Beşiktaş are often put on the opposition side of this divide, which is way too simplistic, because all of those clubs, as I said earlier, have to have government links in order to survive and have many, many supporters of the government amongst their fans. So it's not just the case that, Başakşehir represent success and government success, and these clubs are failing because the opposition are failing. I would caution you not to map politics and sport quite so literally as that. Never is. In some ways, the kind of struggles of the big three represent actually the struggles that the government is having at the moment, in that the Turkish economy isn't in a great shape right now, and Turkish football in the wider European realm is falling further and further behind. It's not all its fault, because across Europe, obviously the top teams are moving further and further away just because of the rising inequality that's coming in. But that has it's affected Turkey quite badly. 10, 15 years ago, Fenerbahçe were getting to the quarterfinals of the Champions League. I don't think anybody expects Başakşehir to get to the quarterfinals next season. So in some ways, with Başakşehir, it's a chance for just reassessment in a way, that they got over the line, and people can start to think, well, what about their model should be replicated? What is related to politics? What is related to actually just good running of a football club? And, hopefully people take the lessons from that.
John McManus is an anthropologist, and for more information on Turkish football, you can read his book, Welcome to Hell, In Search of the Real Turkish Football. This episode was produced by David Goss. I'm Josh Nutter-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today. And before you go, if you're a fan of the show and would like to support us, sign up to our Patreon page where you'll get access to bonus episodes and extra content. And if you can't spare the cash, tell a friend instead. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.